So, let's begin now. Today, I have a presentation about measurement of production incidents, the price of quality. It's based on our experience of production incident measurements. What do we correct? What are the priorities? We have been doing it for more than 18 months, and I'd like to share my experience and tell you what we do well. Maybe you can use our experience in your company while building your own system of the same kind with due consideration of our errors and issues. I am Dmitry Khimion. I am head of quality assurance in Avito. Besides, I orchestrate our production incidents, and this is the agenda. First of all, I'd like to immerse all of you into the context. I'll tell you about typical situations, about interesting cases that we used to classify our approaches. How does the process work in Avito? How do we measure? What do we measure? Some subtle moments, summary and questions. Number one, context. We have a large group, about 40 cross-functional teams. Who of you has cross-functional teams? Right. So, we have the same as in your company, but you can imagine the size. What is interesting? The density of incidents in the company last year was approximately a bit more than one incident per working day. Every day something explodes. It's not a good situation, but taking into account the size, it means that there is one problem per team per month, even less than one problem. Is it good or bad? I don't know, but it's better to avoid incidents altogether. One thing is sure, if the number of incidents goes up, then we can turn into a squirrel, fixing the problems, filling the gaps, and doing nothing useful. We wouldn't like our future to be this type. We want to systematize our incident operations. What are the interesting problems that we can see and classify? So we can divide them by transparency, by visibility, by danger. Let's take transparency. First, number one is well known. We see the problem at once, we react at once, everything is clear, what is wrong, what to change, it's easy. The second one, who knows? Something didn't work, something failed, it works again, it works, and we don't know what exactly happened, but it works. Number three is quite misty. Everything works, but then something fails, and God knows why. The quality degrades, goes down. We try to restore. It works for some time. In 30 minutes, it goes down. Then it may be eliminated. All of a sudden, we realize that we didn't do anything to correct the error, but it disappeared, this is quite dangerous. Then I want to tell you about how we divide them by visibility and danger. The first example is like this. We have a user, it uses our product, buys or sells something, everything looks well, it works, everything seems to be all right, but logging of business data fails. We realize that a certain business critical report failed and we cannot take a business critical decision. And we delay the decision and it negatively affects our business. There is no production incident. It is not visible, but it affects our business. Strange situation. Now, one more situation. We have a microservice. It works with hard proxy with Redis. Redis switched off. We connected to a replica. Then we have an old master, it works again, and then some transactions connect to the master, but others still tried to connect to the second one, and it worked in the read-only mode. So the configuration was wrong. And we realized that the same hub proxy configurations are installed in dozens of Redises with this wrong configuration. And if it works, but if failover takes place, it may lead to a problem. The impact on production is very little, but we disclosed a huge delay bomb, and we don't know when the bomb is going to explode. Then, mission critical microservice, proxy, Redis, master database fails. Failover didn't work. Mission critical service doesn't work. It's a huge problem. You have to pray and try to restore. But 95% of traffic is the read-only traffic, and it still works. For 95% of cases, we continue working. The final impact on Avito was actually very small. The situation is dangerous, but the danger was not as big as you can expect. And we came to the conclusion that we cannot avoid all incidents. It's impossible. It's not a question of whether you are going to have incidents or not. You will have them, for sure. And you must be ready to work in this environment. You have to be ready to work with the incidents, control it, and overcome it. And never, never, never repeat the same problem again and again. This is paramount. It's one of the key issues of incident management. What do we actually do? We call the process life site review. All incidents are divided into two types: production incidents and internal incidents. Today we shall talk about production incidents because this is my job. So what do we do? First of all, we extinguish the fire, then we do all the rest. Ticket, description, what happened, see the monitoring, we try to understand the incident and close the gap. In general, the process looks like this. Having extinguished the fire, we eliminate the problem, describe the situation post-mortem, and then we have two flows. The first flow is small. When the incident is small with a little impact, we give it to the developer team and they correct the code and it works. And then we add data to the knowledge base. If the impact is huge, if our business suffered, our customers suffered, the products suffered, or if the potential is big, maybe it's a delay bomb, then we discuss the ticket in a work group and think what are we going to do in greater detail. We think about actions that can protect us 100%. Then we do the job and add data to the knowledge base. Who is going to open the ticket? We don't have such a person. Anyone can do that. If you see the problem, it doesn't matter whether it has been eliminated or not, whether you see who is affected or not, is it a new unique problem or a repeated problem. The person who noticed the problem describe it and raises the ticket, and then he goes to me. I look at the incident, I realize who am I going to address, in which particular zone the explosion took place. We analyze the situation and think whether we have to discuss it broadly or just correct. As for the ticket, our experience shows that we have 8 key characteristics that help us analyze incident comprehensively. First is impact, the reason, the trigger, the way of elimination, how we notice it, state, action items, platform, and team. Let us discuss them one by one. First, impact with an exclamation mark, because this is what defines how well and how detailed we are going to deal with the incident. It depends on the users, money, and data. We measure money clearly. For example, if it's above a certain financial threshold, we discuss it in detail. Then the reason. It's the problem, the mine that we planted in the product. We didn't test something and a bug lives in the product. We didn't carry out impact analysis and didn't see a certain case. There is no backward compatibility with the previous version, for instance. There is a bad configuration of our proxy that may show us a bad result. So we were lucky that it failed in some light manner. Or maybe we ignored a risk. I corrected everything, it seems to be all right, let's put it into production and hope for the best. Next point is a trigger. It's not the reason, it's a trigger. It's the event which made the reason to affect us. That problem in our proxy lived for several months until it faced a trigger when the bug started acting. The trigger is a catalyzer of the defect, of the bug, which happens in production. It's an important point, and you have to understand it, and you have divided the reason from the trigger. In a typical situation, the trigger was the release. The release cannot be the trigger. The trigger is a process. The trigger may be, for example, a situation when you take an old thing, turn it 5 times, try to put it somewhere, and then the system reacted in a bad way. It's a typical situation. You have to realize the difference between the trigger and the reason. How did we eliminate the problem? In the process of elimination, we usually make such a timeline. What we did, when we did, how long did it take, from the very first point when the incident was raised, when a user applied a certain trigger, the bug started working, and from the very beginning until the end when the problem was totally eliminated. We have to see how fast we reacted and how long did it take us to solve the problem. That is important, and the timeline makes it possible to see who did what and for how long. The next point, how did we disclose the incident? There are 6 points here. How can we disclose the incident? It's very good when in the canary release we saw it on a small percentage of end user, we rolled back, fixed the problem, it's okay. The second stage is when we noticed it before the user, after the canary release, but before the users noticed it. Point 3, when we learned it from the monitoring, because the problem was accumulated and then became visible. Point 4, and that is already dangerous, and when it raises a lot of alarms, when we got a message from the support team. That is bad. It's even worse when your boss comes to you and says, "Do you know that you have this problem?" And we learn it from our boss. That is too bad. And we never saw point 6 when we learn from the press. But some colleagues from big companies, I am not going to name them, had some problems that they learned about from the press. This is the worst case ever. Let's go on. Action items. Action items, it's our actions aimed at prevention of such incidents in the future. Here, in the long run, we have to take some actions. If we do it in a wrong way, we shall face such incidents again and again. For example, let us be more attentive in testing. Let's be more attentive in reviewing. This is not enough. Let us look at the server in a better way. No. This is something we can forget. This is something immaterial. This is something we can ignore. Good actions are, for example, configuring the monitoring or setting up alerts. So that if utilization crosses the threshold, you can see it. Then write automatic tests. And it will help you to see the problem. Add activities in grooming and in some other processes. Change engineering practices or take or do refactoring of the component. The next important point, it's more about analytics. It's a platform. What is the level at which the problem took place? Clustering helps you understand where you have the gaps. For example, storage, services, Kubernetes, or Android, or web. And we realize where to focus our resources and attention, on which part of our system to reduce the number of incidents. So focusing on a certain section of the infrastructure. And the teams who suffered in each incident, what kind of functionality was affected. Maybe it may shoot in one place and 5 more places will be affected. What is an incident, how we analyze it, that's quite clear. Let's move on. The most interesting point and the most important one is the impact. What do we measure? First is customer capital, financial losses, bad term, because this is a wrong term from the financial point of view. And the third point is the data loss. Let's look at them one after another. What do we measure? The customer capital is the customer base. So 10,000 Avito users saw a bug, bad user interface. That is bad user experience. We don't want that. Our application is good and we don't want the users to suffer. Product conversions, the product works, but something is wrong somewhere. For example, registration fails or authorizations failed. Next point, financial losses.
Financial losses are potentially unreceived profits. Why do we use this term? Is because if we had a crash, if we had a breakdown, then the user was trying to pay something. If the user failed to make a payment, it doesn't mean that the user will come back later to make that payment. Let's say in the evening. So we don't know exactly how this failure is going to be stretched over a longer period of time, and how it's going to impact our business. This is a very complicated thing. We are working on it. We have had some successes. For example, we may have breakdowns in billing. There are monetization instruments that work on the website. For example, that involves the purchase of services, providing services to clients, and this is our losses, and this is not very good if we fail to provide a service, and that's our failure. The third component is data. Data is analytic. For example, we fail to create an analytic report. We have user data that we use to get some insights, and also technical monitoring data in order to see the trends, to see statistics, in order to see how resources are utilized, in order to kind of right-size our capacities. Now let's look closer at how we measure each specific component here. Let's look at the client capital here first. Through our monitoring, we'll look at how many sessions were dropped. This can be done. And we'll look at the monitoring. We join this with our analytic and intelligence. So we try to identify the number of unique users that were trying to make a post in a certain category. They were not able to do it. They got upset. they either stopped trying or did it later. These are direct observations that we can take, and there are indirect observations when the effect is not evident to all users, and we cannot measure them directly and accurately in our data. So we decided to make a kind of a clever thing. We partnered with support, and we collect our problem points and HD account. This means help desk counts, which logs user inquiries or user bug reports. That allowed us to understand how many users report problems when they face these problems. So we have quite a lot of variance here, from 30 to 300. This means that every 30th or every 300th user, depending on the severity of the bug or the problem, prefers to report it to the support service, customer service. So that's a very valuable data. And financial losses, another important thing. At the beginning of my presentation, I said that we have the rule that if we have more than 20 story points, why story points? Because to show real money to anybody is, well, perhaps that may scare the faint-hearted. And the second thing is that it's really tricky to calculate the amount of financial losses, so it's better to look at story points. But we learned how to measure them, how to measure these losses. What do? We look at the monitoring, we look at the runtime, we try to measure the correlation between certain microservice quality degradation in a certain component of Avita, and then we try to understand what was going on with our financials. And then we try to correlate user behavior such as payments and other things against our other baseline parameters. So we use really clever models to calculate this delta loss, the loss that we would have received potentially. The biggest explosion that we had was 130 points, and this was a functional bug that we were not able to identify. We couldn't see it for about 2 weeks, and well, at last we found it in an unexpected way. So the biggest breakdown that we had was due to a functional bug, not due to a database getting down. Data losses, well, data losses are easy to calculate. We do our take our monitoring data, we look at the baseline, and then we see how many bad cases there were. Then we try to again correlate the number of users that failed to register against a certain time, against a certain baseline. And then we also have user context. We're not talking about personal details, we're talking about the interaction between the users. And this is a parameter that we believe is important. We were able to learn to monitor it. If we have a lot of context between users, we identify it as a problem and we add it to our losses. All of these things give us an idea about just how big of a breakdown we had in production. Really tricky points. Well, scaling practices, in fact, is difficult. That involves a change in the mindset of our teams. We hold weekly meetings, and every meeting I begin by telling everybody why we're all here, what brings us here, why this matters, why everybody should care, why we're doing this. And I'm telling them that we're here to solve problems, to identify ways to never let this happen again. This is not a finger-pointing exercise. This is not scapegoating or finding someone to blame. That's what I highlight at every meeting. The second point, if you want to do incident management, then be ready to invest at least 30% of your working time, to allocate at least 30% of the time towards this, or at least one person who would take care of orchestrating all of these complicated processes, because it's quite difficult to get an incident ready for discussion, for some meaningful discussion, because people have to do a lot of brain work before an incident is ready for discussion, for discussing what needs to be done in order to make sure that this incident never happens. So that takes a lot of resources. And the third point, if we incorrectly position our process, and if we position it, or if we hold it up as some witch hunt, people will go underground, they will try to go under the radar, and the incidents will not become less numerous in production, but the visibility of these incidents will become much, much lower. That's a very important point, kind of psychological, but very important to remember when you are in production. Now let's move into the conclusions. So what does this give us? What does it give to engineers? So, well, this gives an instrument to fight production engines. If you identify an incident, you deal with it, you address it, you describe it, you try to make sure that it never happens again. This thing also allows us to be ready, to be prepared for any problem, and to better process it, as opposed to kind of avoiding this problem using all sorts of means. And the third point is that this practice is a great source of argument against PMs. You, project managers and so on, you can discuss a specific problem and explain to them how expensive it was for you to solve it, and the value that you brought by addressing a certain problem. So you have something to put on the table in your discussions, and for managers, this gives them the understanding of how these bugs, these breakdowns, quantitatively affect the business, the bottom line. You can do calculations on a quarterly basis, on a weekly basis. You can literally calculate how costly these breakdowns were for us. Second, if you have an Excel-sized team that allows you to kind of keep track of things, keep tabs on everybody, and if you have, let's say, 40 teams, then that's a little bit challenging. And the second thing, it allows you to make hard decisions timely, in a timely fashion. So if there is a big problem, you just say, everybody stop, look at your builds, look at your refactoring, you take these 5 tickets, you do them, and then come back to your sprints, and don't generate any turbulence. There are more complicated solutions, such as to stop making releases in order not to create any additional stress on the system. So we stop all releases, we say, okay guys, we don't make any changes to the production. We have Tiger teams that are involved in optimizing performance. We offload the production, and then we come back to delivering features without any losses to the business side of the house. So these are the key benefits that I would like to tell you about, the benefits that we get from this process. In other words, what's in it for you. That's it from me. Any questions? Off mic. Thanks very much. I'd like to ask you how you organize your work with support. Okay, you get a complaint, but what do you do next? We have a Slack channel through which we work with the support guys. Second of all, the support guys, they have people that are responsible, and if they know where the problem comes from, they can assign this problem to a specific team. If there are some things that are hard to understand, they go to the chat and they raise alarm just to make sure that everybody knows about, well, all the relevant people know about this. But then they open an account. By the way, I forgot to tell you about this HD account. We calculated the size of the HD account, and in order to, if we see that the count of complaints is over 30, that's a critical problem that needs to be fixed urgently. That's something I should have mentioned. We have tickets, we have Slack channels, and people that are on support, they know who to route the problem to. If one appears, we have a few more questions from Slido. Pre-prod. Well, candidate release is just a mechanism for delivering apps to production. For example, we work on 100 pods, then we off-balance 5 pods, we deliver new versions of the app, and 5% of the production traffic is routed to that 5%. We analyze the correctness of the new release operation. We see if it works okay, if it's not broken, if it doesn't have any critical errors, if it doesn't overutilize resources. And then we roll out the new version of the release to all the 100% of our production cluster. That's how it works. Now let's take a look at the next question. Very interesting question. How did you identify the problem? Well, the problem was tricky. We actually found it in an unexpected way. Guys from another department just made a joke that some function didn't work correctly, wasn't working correctly. And at the same time, these words were heard by the right guys, and they got alerted. So this was just a coincidence. The guys who said that there was a problem, they didn't know that there in fact was a problem. But the right guys, the devs involved, were just looked into this thing and found that indeed there was a problem. But this was just a coincidence. But in fact, we have many more problem reports to the support service. Some of them get overlooked. Well, some of the things statistically are not considered significant, and they kind of get under the radar, but they may constitute a problem. Okay, next question. Do you communicate your incidents to whatever that means? Well, this transparency ranking in fact testifies to the level of understanding of a team. In other words, how it understands its production function capacity. It in fact reflects the presence of alerting, the presence of a well-structured collaboration with the support team. It means that some parts of the product in fact work in a way that nobody knows that nobody understands. So, working as part of this process. Working as part of this process by adding additional monitoring features, by adding additional auto tests, alerts, we better understand how the product works. And some unexplained incidents become known, and based on that monitoring, we know what to fix if something needs to be fixed. So the bottom line is that more and more incidents become well known. Well, I hope I have answered your question. Next question: how are alerts set, and who gets them? Very simple. We have over 40 cross-functional teams. Each team is responsible for its specific part of the product, and they have technical and product monitoring, and they only get the alerts that are relevant to them. And in these monitorings, there are thresholds that should not be exceeded. For example, our response time should be less than 200 milliseconds, 99% of it, of there. If 99% or if 75% of the responses are over 300 milliseconds, we get an alert. The relevant team get notification, either in the support team, or in the relevant Slack team. We also have SMS notifications based on the level of seriousness, or based on the grade of this problem or alert. The recipients may be different. The next question is, how do we deal with project and product managers? Good question. Good question. Quite honestly, everything is much more trivial than you may think. It's enough to show a big fat incidence and how it affects product metrics. For example, product owner, as part of quarter objectives, they may have the job of increasing some metric by 2%. If it pushes a command and it enforces the team, if you find a very big fat LSR, an incident, you analyze it, you may see that when we were creating a feature, we decided to skip regression testing. Then we forced this skip, and this person was responsible for this skip. So this is a good argument. You can just come back to this person and say, so you wanted your metrics improved, and you skipped this test, and that's why you have this negative result. So if you don't do it in the future, you'll have a better result. So again, engineers in fact have something to put on the table when they discuss these things with project and project managers. So again, this allows everybody to better understand how the technical team, engineers, how they can affect the product quality and service quality.